And hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Dornbush. This is Podcast Beyond, IGN's weekly PlayStation show and weekly Return of the Jedi spoiler cast. Of course, we're going to be diving deep into the show that we were all talking about before we started this episode. But no, I'm joined this week by Brian Altano.
I still don't know why the Rancor Keeper cried like that, but it's one of the most heartbreaking moments in the whole film.
We're going to spend roughly about 20 minutes later on that, so I look forward to that as well. We're joined this week by Mitchell Saltzman.
What's up, everyone?
Hey, Mitchell. And also joining us this week again, Taylor Lyles. Taylor, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me, Dorno.
And Taylor, especially thank you, little peek behind the curtain. Lucy O'Brien was going to be on this week's episode, but there's massive construction happening at her apartment building, so last minute she had to duck out, and Taylor gracefully jumped in at the last moment. So thank you for hopping in so last minute. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. I guess you could say I'm the real MVP today.
That's yep. That please, Red, put that as Taylor's lower third for the rest of the episode. Before we go on, just wanted to briefly say thank you to everyone who tuned in for our Gamescom episode. We recorded it before it aired, but it was live during the whole Gamescom show. And thank you to everyone who tuned in for the entirety of the Gamescom coverage. That show is obviously a huge undertaking for the entire IGN staff, and a ton of work went into it. Across the board. So thank you to everyone who tuned in for that as well. And I also wanted to just say thank you to everyone for the Podcast Beyond fans who I've been talking to on Twitter recently for the last couple of days. Just thank you to everyone. There's been a lot of kind support for the show. I just wanted to say thank you because you all are wonderful and we love making the show for you. Before we get into the topics for this week, which are going to include PlayStation Plus games, some more Elden Ring to follow up on Mitchell's hands-off preview, and a few other things. I did briefly just also want to put out a call for more memory card stories. Have a few left in the email that I need to go back through and make sure I didn't miss, but please continue to send some more in, and preferably keep them a little bit shorter. I read every story that we get, and some of them are amazing, but some of them have been like college essay level length, and we just probably can't read that long on the show. I appreciate so much people sharing that, but just for the sake of brevity and time, if you can send something a little shorter, basically if you've gone past the double spaced page, you've gone too far.
You could write the long one and then just also have the TLDR version at the bottom, like
that
Twitter.
Works. Yeah, like if you want to share that story with us, we're grateful to that and really, really appreciate the candor and honesty that everyone shared with these. But just in terms of sharing them on the show, we want to make sure we can, crystallize them and get them out there for the audience. So appreciate if you're willing and able to do that. But other than that, I think that's all the housekeeping for the beginning of this show. Let's jump in before we get to the Return of the Jedi discussion, of course. Let's jump in. Briefly wanted to mention this month's PlayStation Plus games were announced the day we're recording this. They include Overcooked All You Can Eat, which is for PS5. That is the Overcooked bundle, so it includes Overcooked 1 and 2 and a few other of the DLC packs and things like that. And then for PS4, and then, of course, PS5 backward compatibility, is Hitman 2 and Predator Hunting Grounds. So this is a pretty heavily, third-party, obviously, month for it. I think if you've missed out on any of those games, it's a pretty wide selection, and so hopefully there's something that appeals to you. It's definitely sort of an odd mishmash of things. Brian, I'll just throw to you quickly. What do you feel about this month's games?
I'm into it, actually. I mean, I personally have all of them, so it's kind of a bummer for me. But if you have been on the fence about getting any of these, this is a great opportunity to jump in. Overcooked, everybody has said enough about this game, but it's worth saying one more time that if you are looking for like a really fun co-op couch game to play with, potentially somebody who doesn't play a lot of video games, or you're trying to get like a friend or a roommate, your partner or something like that to get into video games, this is a great one. And it maybe will make them never want to play video games again too, because you'll be fighting over, burned food or whatever. Hitman's great. More Hitman's though is awesome. The Hitman's one of the best games this year, so play Hitman 2. And Predator Hunting Grounds is like a really, really interesting, really fun sort of asymmetrical multiplayer game that I had a really good time with. And they're continuing to add new skins and DLC to it all the time. So it's made by Ilphonic. They've been doing cool stuff recently. So yeah, download these games, check them out. Even if you don't get to them immediately, just queue them up, put them in your library so you have them forever.
Yeah, it's a good sort of jumble of things. And yeah, as Brian said, I think we've talked about Overcooked plenty on the show, but just for reference, All You Can Eat is the PS5 version. So it has improved frame rate, and that's definitely been one of the things. Sometimes those games, when you have 4 people going and it's as crazy and complex as the game gets, it can run a little bit slowly. This kind of improves all of that. And like I said, it has all of the content from that series. So definitely go check that out. And yeah, Predator started a little bit rocky, but as you said, they've been supporting it, since launch. Ilphonic has been doing a really great job of that. They just released Arcadegeddon earlier this year as well. So they've got their hands busy with multiplayer games, but yeah, it's cool to see those three.
And
Mitchell.
And I'll just say that Hitman 2 is my favorite of the Hitman trilogy. So if you have not played Hitman, please get on that train because you are missing out. And I've seen a bunch of people already this year who jumped on with Hitman 3 and have said that I passed on this game for the longest time, and I went back and played all three of them. So man, what a game. Hitman 2.
Is that the one with the racetrack?
Mission? That's one of my favorite levels.
Oh, yeah. Right.
That mission's so good. Taylor, I don't know about you. Are you a fan of any of these games? Are you interested in checking them out? If you're not, what's your sort of...
I'm actually interested in playing Hitman 2. Is that the game that also had that boomerang looking suitcase where you throw it in?
Yes. The homing boomerang. It's so good. You throw the boomerang when they're on the jet ski. Oh, it's so good.
When I saw that, I think it was on Twitter, I saw that, I was like, I have to play this game now. So the fact that it's free for PlayStation Plus, I was like, wow, this is even more of an incentive for me to play the game now.
Yeah, it's definitely a good one to jump into. There's no commentary on the PlayStation blog at this point, so I don't know if it's true, but I know that in Hitman 3, you can import the levels for 1 and 2. I know there's been some weird stuff where games were available for PlayStation Plus, but didn't always give you benefits like that. So double check if it does let you import after you download it and play everything in Hitman 3, because Hitman 3 is amazing, and I keep forgetting that came out this year. But yeah, we have a lot of other stuff to discuss for this month. Those come out next week, I believe, Tuesday, September 7th, and they'll be available to Monday, October 4th. So let's jump into some other topics. As, of course, if you listened to last week's episode or watched it live, you'll know that Mitchell gracefully jumped in the midst of preparing all of his preview content for Elden Ring to speak to Brian and Max a little bit about the hands-off preview that he had of Elden Ring. And I thought we could take this as an opportunity to, now that it's been a few more days, you've had a little bit more time to think about it. And also, people have had time to now see the sort of full breadth of your coverage, to get some questions from the audience. But before we jump into it, Mitchell, and I apologize that you're going to have to talk quite a bit for the next few minutes, but I did just sort of want to say, is there anything that a few days removed, what really sticks out to you from what you saw or people's reactions to, descriptions of what people have seen? What's sort of been kind of sticking in your mind about the game?
The one thing that I've learned is that, surprise, surprise, the Elden Ring community is very hungry for new gameplay. And I hate to disappoint anyone, there still will not be any new gameplay shown in this podcast. It's always a bummer when you get to see something really cool and you're not able to actually show what you saw. I wish I was able to, just project from my mind into all your minds everything that, I was able to take a look at. But yeah, that's the big thing. The bummer of not being able to show people what the 15 minutes that, the select few groups of media people got to see. But yeah, I still stand by everything that, I wrote in the preview. I thought it looked amazing. I cannot wait to play it. And I think Elden Ring is doing a lot of things very interesting in the soul space that I think people are going to really be into. And
I do hope we get that Cerebro-esque technology one day to see what's going on in your brain. But speaking of that, I guess a few questions did sort of talk about Elden Ring in context of other Souls games. And I do want to get to that, but I do also want to, of course, as you said, don't expect to see new gameplay here of any kind. We're obviously just still going off of Mitchell's impressions. They didn't give any sort of public announcement on when there will be new things shown, correct? Because a few people did ask about that. Cool.
No.
This reminds me of, was it Cyberpunk a few years ago? There was a big BCD thing, and a bunch of press people got to see it and then weren't allowed to basically leak it or reveal it or show it. And we just had to do a lot of very old school, magazine style coverage where there's 4 screenshots and then a lot of words. But yeah, don't shoot the messenger on this. I saw a lot of comments being how come there's no new gameplay? And it's, Mitchell had to play by the rules. And I'm glad that you got to see it and write about it and talk about it, because that's as good as we'll get for a while.
Yeah, and luckily, we're less than half a year away from the release date, so it's not too far off. But to jump into some of these questions, first one from Phil that I wanted to bring up was, from what you saw, and I know you talked a little bit about sort of the map integration for this game, which is unique for Elden Ring compared to other Souls games. Did you get a sense of how big the map is, or how big the world was in general, based on what you saw, and especially like just any sort of breadth of comparison to other open world games that you can pull from?
Yeah, so when they brought up the map, they kind of panned a little bit to like the left. So the first area is that the first area that they showed was that first open area that you've seen in trailers. It's the one with like the air tree in the background. And then they panned to the left, and it ended up being, I think it's right after the first Legacy dungeon. And it was like a huge open valley with a forest in the middle. And then there was all kinds of stuff, to the right of that. So, I think in comparison to other open worlds, it's probably not going to be as big as The Witcher. It's not going to be as big as Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but it's one of those things where it's going to be a very dense map. I think the biggest clue to how big this world is going to be is that they've said that there's going to be 6 actual areas. And each of those areas is going to have its own legacy dungeon. So just kind of imagine like, I want to say, imagine like a Blight Town, a big area before Blight Town, and then a bunch of dungeons all interspersed in that area, and that's one section. And then there's 6 of those. So that's kind of how I've been reconciling the size of Elden Ring's map in my own head.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it was kind of it's the map seems big. I'll just say the map seems very big, but it's not on the same level as an Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Witcher 3, if that answers the question.
I'm like very okay with that personally, because I feel like there at least for a while there was sort of like an arms race to see who could make the biggest open world game, and I think there's value to that in some ways, but I also think that like I'd rather have something that's a little more sort of like constrained and bespoke but interesting than sprawling and endless. I actually personally get overwhelmed with like when open world games get too big, and there isn't like a ton to do there. I appreciate the sort of minimalism of some of them, but like at some point I just go like, I'm never going to see all this, and this is a game where I probably will explore every corner, because one of my favorite things to do in games like this is to tread into an area where you're like, oh, am I supposed to be here yet? Oh no, I'm not. These things are ready to murder me. Like, yeah, that discovery and immediate followed by immediate humility is one of my favorite cycles of the Soulsborne genre.
Yeah, and I think you'll get that in Elden Ring for sure. Like there were definitely areas that I looked at on the map and I'm like, oh man, if like it seems like going left is the way you want to go, and going right is just like a recipe for destruction, for just death. So I think that it is that kind of thing where, like in Dark Souls 1, there's no real guidance on where you go, but you get beaten into that path. Like if you try to go to the graveyard and go down to the Tomb of the Giants straight away, you're gonna get the heck beaten out of you by skeletons, and then you're just gonna wander into a dark area that you're not gonna be able to see where you're going. So I think
I just started replaying that game a couple weeks ago. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm just going to run full speed down this. And everyone's like, ah!
It's not going to end well.
Yeah.
So I envision Elden Ring being very similar along those lines.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm very much the same way. I would always prefer a smaller but more, as Brian said, like bespoke and dense world than one that, there, as you said, there's value in expansion and seeing what you can do with wider spaces. But yeah, something like this, I'm cool with it being smaller, but having a ton to do in those spaces. Speaking of sort of talking about the space of it as well, Timelander asked, and this may be something that's hard to see from what you watched, but was there any dynamic weather? Or I'm just curious, what is it like being in the world? Because we are seeing different times of day. There are hints at some different like weather patterns, but was that changing as you went, or did that seem more like location specific?
There was not dynamic weather. I'm pretty sure the conditions of the weather are very dependent on what like area you're in, what biome you're in. So like I said, that first open area has that, very yellowish sky. And then the second area that we saw, the one with the big valley and the like forest in the middle, it was much more overcast and kind of like a bluish, cloudy kind of sky. And then right here is the first legacy dungeon, if you're watching on video, and that's also in the first area, and it gets a little more cloudy as you're getting further into that that second area with the valley. So yeah, I think the areas are very dependent, or the weather is very dependent on what area you're in.
Cool. Moving on from there, Damon asked, did it seem like Elden Ring's jump mechanic made an impact in combat? I.e., in Sekiro's combat, jumping is vital, whereas obviously in the Souls games, you're more grounded, literally. So did it feel like you were more anchored to the ground like a Souls game, or did it feel like jumping did really play an impact in the gameplay you saw?
I don't think it's going to have the same impact as it does in Sekiro's combat, because in Sekiro, you use jumping as like one of your main defensive tools. Like if enemies are sweeping, you're going to have to jump over that sweep. I haven't seen anything along those lines in Elden Ring. It does seem much more like the traditional Soul style of combat. But what they did say is that you have a jump attack, and that jump attack can blow away guards. So it's kind of like another heavy attack. It's another attack that you have in your arsenal. And I imagine that attack is going to be very specific depending on what weapon you're using. So I think it is going to be important in that way. You're going to have this new attack in your arsenal that some enemies are probably going to react, maybe poor to than if you were just to, do a regular weak attack or strong attack.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, honestly, everything you say just telling me more about this game is like, oh, I just really want to play Elden Ring right now. So it's good to hear all of this.
You're hanging out with some friends and putting back a few drinks. A few becomes a few too many. As the evening comes to an end and people start to head out, you think of calling for a ride. Nah, you live nearby. You can make it home okay. It's no big deal. What are the odds you'll get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Your insurance goes up, you lose your license, you lose your job, you total your car, you kill someone? Everyone knows about the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that still doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So, if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over.
Ryan asked, I don't believe it's McCaffrey. Ryan said, given some of the beautiful games we've experienced this year, and after seeing what Bluepoint did with Demon Souls, did the graphics feel underwhelming, or did they feel like up to par with current games? Do you think it will be an issue at launch in any way? Like, but what was your general impression of it graphically?
Graphically, FromSoft makes some beautiful games. It's not on the same level as Demon Souls, because obviously Demon Souls was made from the ground up for PlayStation 5. There's no PlayStation 4 version of the Demon Souls remake. So this has a look that is kind of reminiscent, I think, of Dark Souls 3, of Bloodborne. It feels along the same lines of quality. But that said, like, it's still absolutely gorgeous. The draw distance is super impressive. The art design is, second to none in terms of this style of game. And yeah, I was super impressed by what I saw, but not blown away in the way I would be if it was, a PlayStation 5 exclusive or a game that like screams, current gen PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, etc. Oh, I don't think I can hear you anymore.
You couldn't, because I muted my mic while I took a sip of water. Obviously tell me if Mitchell and Brian, if I'm way off base. And Taylor, before we go any further, are you a huge Souls person, or are you someone who hasn't played? Are you interested in Elden Ring? Like, where do you sit with Soulsborne?
Yeah, so I actually do like the Soulsborne games. I haven't played Sekiro yet, but I'm really excited for Elden Ring. And, I'm just like echoing what Brian said earlier too. I think if it was like a mass open world, I don't know how much I'd be emotionally invested in like searching every corner. I feel with some open world games, there's that issue of quantity over quality. So it's like, oh, there's all this stuff I could do, but if it all feels a little bit the same, what difference does it make if I complete all of it? You know what I mean? So I'm actually kind of curious to see what they do with Elden Ring. Just that teaser trailer that we saw, like the announcement, the reveal trailer, I was hyped for it. Reading Mitchell's preview, I was like, can I play this right now? Or just find a time machine and just skip to January so I can play it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff coming out in these next few months, but yeah, I'm really itching for January. But yeah, I feel like with Soul, especially with FromSoft, when it comes to their games, like even when it isn't pushing the boundaries like on a technical level, they always seem to really have this style that I think lives through. And even something like, Brian, I know you're saying you're just starting Dark Souls Remastered. Like I played it a few months back for the first time. Yes, it doesn't hold up to modern Souls games, of course, on a graphical level, but the art style is so interesting and so engrossing that it kind of doesn't matter as I play.
Yeah, art direction goes a long way in video games, especially. I mean, it's such a visual medium, right? And it's also, I think that like the FromSoft design philosophy is so rooted in sort of quintessential classic horror movie monsters that I love so much, right? Like that's one of my favorite genres in the world. There's a practicality to the way their enemies and creatures are constructed that almost feel like something you would see in like a vintage Clive Barker movie or something like that. Like it's very much like you could feel like the theoretically these would be practical effects if they were to make a movie out of this, right? Like there's tattered pieces of rag hanging off and like weird skin and, you know, bones jutting out. There's all this like really, really cool stuff. And so I will take a more condensed open world that's rife with horrifying creatures and monsters and awesome things to, you know, shriek and awe at. Rather than something like, you know, not to throw Assassin's Creed under the bus. The recent Assassin's Creed games have been vast and massive, but it's mostly like I understand who I'm interacting with. It's a lot of the same people over and over again. And I'm like, I love going into the sort of like high fantasy corners of video games. Like stuff like this is where things get really, really interesting. I like some of these creature designs are incredible. They're so cool. And I can't wait to turn a corner and just go, what is that? You know?
I really want the Jim Henson Company of the 80s, like of the Dark Crystal era, to make like a real life puppetry of so many of these creatures. It's just wild.
Make a puppeteered kids FromSoft TV show.
Perfect. FromSoft, Jim Henson Company, obviously. Call us. We'll work it out.
Did you see there was an artist on Twitter recently? I retweeted him, but he shared a bunch of images he did of basically Muppets and Sesame Street characters drawn in the Bloodborne art style. It worked way too well. It worked way too well.
I have to see this.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well,
yeah, I gotta see this.
Yeah, well, if you guys can't find it, we'll link it after the show. It's really cool. Moving through just a couple other questions. Some rando on the internet named Red asked, who is the protagonist's favorite band?
This is such a good question that I actually asked Kitaro-san while I had my Q&A.
What?
And surprisingly, he said BTS. BTS is the Tarnished's favorite band.
What year does this?
That's not true. That's not true.
Oh my god! Well, it looks like Elden Ring does have permission to dance. That's for the BTS fans.
I don't know.
Look forward to the Elden Ring McDonald's meal coming in February. By the way.
The BTS DLC pack where your character gets to dress as Jimin is going to just be fantastic. The BTS fandom. Moving on from there, last but not least, Casey also asked, again, not Casey DeFreitas of our staff, heard about the summons in the game, and obviously I know this is something that's been touched on, but is that something you can use whenever you want once you get it, or are there very specific conditions in which you can summon? Can you just speak a little bit about what you know of summons?
So from what I have heard about summons. Summons are like a stat that you can, spec your character into. So if you go like big on summons, you're kind of, limiting the amount that you can spend in like vitality, endurance, strength, et cetera, et cetera. And they also said that there are like monuments that you can visit to summon at those monuments. So I think it is I don't think you can summon everywhere. I think I had the actual quote prepped here. And then you'll keep these as infinite use items that you can use at special monuments around the map, especially in places where there are a lot of enemies present. So you'll be able to summon them and use them to fight alongside alongside at your preference. So yeah, so you'll get a summon item basically that item will be for a specific monster, and once you get it, you have unlimited uses of it. But it seems like you have to use it at certain spots, so you can't just use it throughout the whole world. But those spots are usually the places that you'd want to use them in anyway. If that answers the question.
You had mentioned last week that like gathering those summons is sort of like Castlevania Aria of Sorrow or something, where you're repeatedly grinding on enemies until like they drop a thing that you can then equip.
Yeah, but not all spirit summons are gained that way. Like I've found out that some of them are, but others you can find in vendors, others you can just find out in the world as like a shiny. So there's a lot of different ways that you can collect these summons. I don't think it's like exactly like Castlevania where you just you go to a bonfire, you kill an enemy, you go back to the bonfire, you kill an enemy, go back to the bonfire, kill an enemy. Oh, I got the summon. I can move on.
I used to marathon like entire TV shows while doing that, just running in and out and fighting the same like merman over and over.
Yeah. Best way to get through podcasts if you're backed up. I'm really fascinated to see more of that aspect of the game. I think it's a really interesting twist on a thing that is a core part of Souls games when it comes to like summoning other players. But the idea that this is a more complex thing within the game in Elden Ring and something that you can stat and build into is a really fascinating approach. Mitchell, between obviously your discussion last week on the show and all the questions here, is there anything else that you want to make sure we touch on before we move on to other topics, or anything you feel like in the Elden Ring hole that you have learned that you feel like hasn't gotten the spot?
I think just maybe like highlighting the fact that this is a world where there's like just so much excitement for exploration. Like one of my big takeaways from watching the demo was just how much I wanted to take the control away and be like, okay, but what if we went here? What if we went this way? What would I find? Like I mentioned in the preview, like even just during the legacy dungeon, and you think of these legacy dungeons as like self-contained dungeons, but as I like looked off in the distance, there was like a lone house on a bridge, and I was just like, man, what is in that house? How do I get there? Is that tied to the legacy dungeon? Is it something that I can get to after I get through the legacy dungeon? So just like the feeling of wanting to know what's beyond certain barriers is like the most enticing thing I think that I can take away from watching that Elden Ring presentation.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for answering all these questions, Mitchell, and thank you to everyone out there who responded with those and are as curious as we all are about this game. And Mitchell, you've continued to knock it out of the park with your Elden Ring coverage. And even though we only have a few more months before it comes out, I hope there will be more beats for you to continue to show off how awesome of a knowledgeable Soulsborne person you are. Because it's always great to talk to you about it. But yeah, as was probably referenced last week as well, but you can check out all of the Elden Ring coverage on IGN, all of Mitchell's coverage, the discussion last week on Beyond, video preview, again, not with new gameplay, but going in depth on what you saw. And we'll definitely continue to talk about that one as we get closer. But moving on, I want to talk about a few other subjects. First one we're going to jump into from some of the recent conversations going on is a more PlayStation-related conversation, and that's one dealing with Naughty Dog and crunch. And this is, of course, something that's come up a lot in the last couple of years related to, obviously, The Last of Us Part 2 and sort of broader looks at Naughty Dog and other companies within the gaming industry when it comes to the discussion around crunch. This is something that continues to come up, and this time it came from an interview with Naughty Dog leads Neil Druckmann and Evan Wells in Game Informer, I believe it was. I swear I just heard some crows.
Yeah, what was that? That was
me. Bloodborne has entered into my reality.
I was going to say like we're in Elden Ring.
Yeah, there is an exclusive Elden Ring pre-order bonus where they do send you 3 live crows. Come to your house for a couple months to help you count down the game.
Apparently,
the sky has just turned blood red.
Did you hit the summon button on your keyboard?
Fun fact, I was reading, apparently crows can be like extremely kind and recognize people. And
Oh.
if you are kind to them, they will be kind to you and essentially like kind of protect you. So
Wow.
Mitchell, be good to those crows. Anyway, shifting back to, something completely related to those crows, PlayStation. I'm going to talk a little bit about this discussion. I just want to pull out a few highlights from this. Obviously, there were news stories on IGN, and the full interview is on Game Informer that you can read with Evan and Neil. It goes through a ton else than crunch, but obviously the crunch aspects got sort of the focus of discussion. One or two of the things that were discussed were both crunch and unionization. On the crunch side, I did want to pull a couple specific comments. These are in response to a question. Naughty Dog is such a proven track record, but that hasn't come without a cost. Over the years, you've come under fire for studio crunch. Could you speak to your personal experience with crunch and how that's affected the studio? Evan replied, I have definitely personally worked very hard over the years. I think some of that has helped me get to where I am in my career. As a studio, we've all worked hard together, and we are working very hard on every project to find the right balance, just like we do in all of our technical aspects of creating a game. We have postmortems, and we look at how the animation went, and we look at how the design went, and we dig really deep into all the things that we could have been better, and the things we got right. We do the same thing with production. We look at how the whole game was created and where we can make improvements and how we can strike the right balance between giving the opportunity to, as I mentioned earlier, leave their mark on the industry and advance their craft in ways that have never been achieved, but also find space along that spectrum. And then Neil said, we have so many talented people that are good at solving problems, whether they're creative or technical. Let me go back to The Last of Us Part 2. Some pillars that were important to us were diversity in the people we hire and the characters that we have in our game, as well as accessibility and how do we make our games more accessible. Likewise, we are looking at quality of life for preventing burnout to employ the brain power we have in our studio. And we started coming out with working groups to talk about the areas in the studio where we can improve. We worked a particular way when we were 40 people. Now we have to evolve as we keep growing. And there's a little bit more as they go on. Neil says everyone has a different definition of what crunch means. And I guess for us, we think of it as how do we look out for the well-being of our colleagues and everyone that works at Naughty Dog, which is some combination of how many hours you work and how much stress you're feeling, whether that's something that's going on in the office or at home. We find that there is no one solution that fits everybody. Everybody has a unique situation we might need to address. And Brian, I want to start with you because obviously we've talked a lot in the past about obviously, Naughty Dog's games and the crunch sort of discussion around it. Mm-hmm. They're clearly not denying that crunch has happened at the studio, but obviously talking about some of it's this weird complex conversation where I think they're talking about some of the benefits of how hard their team has worked and the things they've produced, like the accessibility advancements that have happened out of The Last of Us Part 2 and things like that. But at the same time, the reality of, is this causing burnout within the studio? Is this advancement shouldn't come at the disregard for employee, livelihood, I feel like is an important thing that they seem to be talking around here, but I feel like is a key component of a way to solve crunch.
Talking around is the exact that. Yeah, I think you nailed it right there. Yeah. That's what I won't call it a non-answer, but it does feel like they are kind of beating around the bush here. The thing with a lot of this is people historically call this crunch culture, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a specific demand from the higher up in the company forcing people to be reprimanded if they don't stay past a certain hour. But there is that sort of you don't want to be the first person to walk out of the room when everybody's working late. And everybody listening to this show has worked a job where they've had to get there early or they've had to leave late. And many of you have probably found that in those margins outside of what you are, sort of specifically hired to work in your hours, you might find gold. You might actually find some wonderful solutions to things. There is a bizarre creativity that comes in those weird pockets of delirium that happen. I've been privy to that. We just almost wrapped up event season. There were a lot of early mornings, a lot of late nights and weekends and stuff like that. And I'm not going to pretend like my job is any harder than anybody listening, because I'm not out building construction sites and breaking rocks and stuff like that, working in a mine. But I do think that there is, over the last few years, a conversation that's happened a lot in the video game industry where a lot of the negative traits that were normalized for very, very long are starting to come to light. And a lot of people are realizing, hey, it is possible to make games without this. And, or maybe without it being 100% of a thing, but maybe pulling back a lot, right? When this generation or last generation started, Rise Son of Rome was one of the sort of flagship launch games. And the studio behind it famously tweeted out, bragging about how many pizzas they ordered for their staff to work late at night, crunching on that game. And that was one of the first times I remember watching a bunch of devs on Twitter and a bunch of fans as well sort of react and go, wait, don't make this like a normal thing. Like there's, obviously you guys hit a deadline. You had a deadline. This was supposed to be a big flagship launch game for the Xbox at the time. And this came at the expense of your employees. And reading stories about the personal ramifications of this stuff, people that even with the Blizzard stories that just came out recently, there are people that their relationships failed. They got divorced. They didn't get to see their friends or their family or their kids or anything like that. And I don't think that personally, the selfish benefit of my satisfaction of playing a video game by X or Y date is worth the personal and health ramifications of those sacrifices. And so I'm glad it's something that's going to continue to be talked about. I hope that because there was a fire under Naughty Dog's ass last time around, it seems, given this interview, that there will continue to be, that for their next game or whatever they're working on next, there's less of a pressure on their staff to do that. And so I'm glad these conversations are happening. Again, everyone listening, you probably have a hard job. You've had to do this. I think that those situations should be rectified as well. This is not just you're listening to a video game podcast that's talking about a video game problem, but this is a problem at many, many jobs. And I think that having the conversation here, the rising tide raises all boats. And I think that sort of openly discussing crunch culture and overworking employees and underpaying them is a big part of like the human experience right now. And it's important to talk about that. And I hope that Naughty Dog sees that. They continue to see the backlash on this, and they make the lives for their employees healthier and safer and better, because I'm glad to wait however long it takes for whatever they make next, because I know it'll be great.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say, but it is always, of course, worth saying here that like in no way do we want to support crunch in a way that says it is okay for people to, continue to have to suffer to make a game. As Brian said, like we are always willing to wait longer for a game to come out if it means people get to have a better work-life balance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of like why I think this interview struck a chord with a lot of people in a frustrating way because of the talking around of things, in terms of like it is a systemic problem that goes far beyond Naughty Dog and like in the wider industry and in just our wider lives and culture. But it's this idea that, oh, maybe they're not telling us we have to work 80-hour weeks, but I see this other person on my team working an 80-hour week and they're doing a lot of great work, so maybe I need to do that too. And it's about the companies finding solutions to help solve that. And obviously part of that often comes up is a thing about unionization. And I think this is a thing that people really were frustrated by. And I think quite understandably was a little right after that, the interview asked, one of the things that the industry has talked about as a possible solution is unionization. Do you have thoughts on unionization? And Evan replied, I haven't put a lot of thought into that. I don't know if that would be a solution for crunch. And I think they just shouldn't have said, I don't think a lot about that, because I think it's impossible to not be the head of a company in an industry that talks about unionization a lot and not have thought about what it would mean for your employees to unionize, good or bad from your perspective. Like that just has to be a thing that is on their mind.
Well,
and if it's not, that's really bad.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also, this is not an indie studio making a quaint puzzle platforming game. This is a studio that is making AAA, deliberately cinematic stuff that I would say is at its best, up there with, top tier Hollywood movie productions. They're working with actors who and mocap actors, voice actors, one and the same these days, many of which are unionized. It's not like they are completely separated from this. Like in the movie industry, there are, you don't necessarily have the same exact thing where a game wraps and everyone gets fired, or a movie wraps and everyone gets fired. Those teams will move from production to production. The the production teams that we specifically partner with during event season at IGN are people that are working deliberate hours. They get deliberate lunch breaks and stuff like that. Like, that is very organized. That's a big part of Hollywood. And so if you're going to be like, oh, our games are, the movie experience, and they're even getting, HBO adaptations, Google what a union is. Look it up.
Yeah, I think quite understandably that answer really bothered a lot of people, myself included, because it's something that just has to have been on your mind, and if it isn't, that is a very worrying concern. I do think in terms of the broader point, and it's one of those things where it's like, I am not saying what they're saying is a justification for allowing crunch to continue, but I think the idea that there could be a multifaceted response to crunch is a reasonable thought to have. And I do think it's worth pointing out that a developer from Naughty Dog, Anthony Vaccaro, an environment artist, sort of responded to this a little bit on Twitter of people talking about this interview, and said, the effort put in by leadership and employees over the last year plus to find multiple solutions for crunch and studio culture is dramatic. Finding the balance of letting devs push for things they are passionate about while not causing themselves or others to crunch is difficult and takes time. The one-size approach has always failed, and leads recognize that, so the whole team is working hard for multiple solutions. Instead of leadership just telling the studio X or Y will be the solution, they have been engaging the entire studio to speak up, participate in finding ways to combat crunch from various different angles and what's important to each employee in a work-life balance. Change doesn't happen instantly and takes a lot of hard work from all members of the team, which thankfully we have. And they were responding to someone else. But I think that is a very valid point to be made, that like in a creative pursuit like this, you have to allow for people who do want to engage with their work for, perhaps, as you were saying, Brian, like during Gamescom or during event season, we will work nights and weekends to be able to get this stuff delivered, but then we take the appropriate amount of time off afterward to make something like that happen. And that's not always the case everywhere, but like that's something that we are fortunate to be able to engage in.
Mm-hmm.
But that, like, finding the solutions for things like that across different teams and ideas of that nature can apply, but so can unionization. And so can making, and something like unionization at its base level will ensure protections and safeties so that passion doesn't turn into, abusing that passion to get work done at a demonstrably, in a way that demonstrably hurts the employees, which I think is why people push for unionization so much.
Totally agree. One last thing I want to say in this before, I feel like I'm hogging all the air here, but the thing that I think a lot of people are forgetting is that these games aren't made in a vacuum anymore. These massive AAA games are made by giant studios that are also connected with international basically development houses, third-party outlets that are doing things like animation and texture gathering and asset photography, all that kind of stuff. And so even if you can fix the problem internally at a studio like Naughty Dog, they could potentially be outsourcing from a studio in an international company that does have a culture of crunch. And so that's something that has to be sort of rectified as well, right? These are not just games that it's not just 20 people in a room working on a game anymore, right? Like if you look at the Assassin's Creed games, they were made by massive studios. Rockstar Games, massive studios. Companies all over the world, Pocket Studios all over the world are helping in conjunction to make this stuff. And sometimes they are reaching out to third parties and small independent places that are basically just, gathering assets or, creating textures. And those people are working, nights and weekends, and we don't really hear about those stories as much. So I'm hoping again that like all of this starts to come to light, and we do find a solution for everybody.
Mitchell and Taylor, I don't mean to hog the discussion. I gotta stop doing that every time I take a drink. I just don't want you to hear my weird mouth noises. I obviously, Brian and I have been covering this a lot on the show, throughout the years, and so I don't want to prevent either of you from jumping in about this. But yeah, it's something that I hope we hear about the solutions as well. Obviously, a lot of the crunch stories come out from reports and people speaking up anonymously for fear of retribution and things like that. But I do genuinely hope we hear about these solutions that may be being worked on, and whether they work, whether they don't, and sort of the processes that get put in place if those things are being worked on. Because I do think I 100% believe unionization is very important, and if the developers can work toward that, that is massively important. But I also want to know, okay, they are working on this. I would love to hear the results of this. And as the developer, the environmental artist, Anthony said, these things take time. And so I'm not expecting them to, come up with a solution overnight. But as Naughty Dog gets into development of its next games, I would love to hear about their approach in changing things to what they feel needs to be changed and how that gets received. I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the production of their next game. But Mitchell, I'll just throw to you first. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to this conversation, but.
Yeah, I mean, I've been following the conversation a lot on Twitter, and I see a lot of people that are responding to this article and just being like, no, it is that simple. Mandatory 40-hour work weeks. Like, that's what other companies do. That's what should be done. And, I'm not a game developer. I can't speak to what that would be like. But I could say that if there was a mandatory 40-hour work week at IGN, it would cause me so much stress, because then coming down to the end of the day, instead of it being like, oh man, it's almost 5 o'clock, it's almost time to go home, that becomes like, I have an hour left to get my work done. And when you're in, to writing reviews, editing reviews, sometimes it's much less stressful on my mental health to be like, okay, I'm going to put in another hour or two so that when I wake up the next day, I can feel better about the amount of work that I have to do to get this thing done, rather than, I have to cut off at 5 o'clock and now the next day I have to rush and get everything done before my deadline, or I have to have that uncomfortable conversation with my boss and tell them that I wasn't able to get it done in time. Mm-hmm. So I don't think the solutions to crunch are super simple. I agree with a lot of the sentiment coming from, what was his name, Anthony?
Yes, yeah, the developer.
Yeah, where this has to be a process. They have to figure out something that works. And I also agree with Neil where he says that the definitions of crunch are different. I am 100% against the idea of crunch where it's mandatory 10 to 12 hour work days for a condensed period of time to get something out the door. Like, that shouldn't happen. I am against the idea of people sleeping in their cubicles because they need to get work done and they feel like they can't go home. That is a massive problem on the production side that needs to be addressed. That said, the idea of crunch being, people who are, who want to get something done or want to put a little extra polish on something before they wrap up for the day. I as someone who also feels like that, it's hard for me to get behind, the solutions that would snuff that out.
Yeah, it's excuse me, it's really complex in that way, especially as I think, people across the board who we have creative buy-in to the things that we're making, and we care in that way about those things. And so it's that balance, right, of making sure you are putting in maybe those extra hours for a day, but that shouldn't be your day every day. Or if you're putting that in for a particular review, and at least on my end, Dan, our reviews editor, is pretty good about telling me make sure to take a comp day for that, because I know you did a weekend day for that, and things of that nature. And those things need to be sort of like stated, built-in practices as part of a company's culture. But yeah, as you said, like when things get to that level where people feel the pressure to do that, where they're sleeping in their cubicles, where they're working constantly for demanded for 6 weeks at a time to work 12-hour days, that's a failure on a production level, and that shouldn't exist. And
yeah, and I just want to go back to what you said about Dan. Like, I want to say, as someone who does a lot of reviews, who does a lot of edits, I just want to shout out Dan and Destin for just being wonderful whenever they know that I've been working long hours, and just, they infer it's like, Mitchell, you have to take time off. And I'm like, okay, I will take time off.
Speaking of, we'll get to just the sheer number of incredible reviews you're able to pump out in a little bit. But before we switch topics, Taylor, anything you wanted to mention on the topic before we switch gears?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing with what everyone else has said, I will gladly wait longer for a game if that means that developers do not have to crunch and basically get rid of any sense of a personal life they have just to make sure I get to enjoy this game. Game development is not hard. I've never developed a game. I'm not going to say I have. I don't, but I can see that there's definitely a lot of work that's put into it. Just the times I've had to write stories of like some issues like bugs and things like that. For some reason, I just keep thinking about that Skyrim bug where the bee kept causing, oh my God, I was like, it was a virtual bee. It wasn't like an actual bug. It was a virtual bee causing chaos. And I was like, wow, the fact that something like that happens, I was like, I can't even imagine how much headache it can be to just like the step of just making a game from start to finish. It's just, it's crazy. It's impressive. I wish I could do it. But when I hear stories about how games I love and hearing about people who worked on it basically having to essentially suffer to make sure that this product comes out pretty polished, it makes me feel a little guilty. And mental health and things like that, and people who have to basically grind to get a game out and get the product out on time for all, for their management, for shareholders, all that stuff. It's a little disheartening because we see that there's burnout in game development, and the turnaround and the short retention that there is for game development. Clearly crunch is not helping in this. So if there's an opportunity where they can address the crunch, and of course crunch is always going to be different and things like that, and I can't speak too much about working extra hours because I'm a little guilty of that. But I like that management tries to hold me accountable and make sure hey, I know you're putting it, you stayed a little longer, you should try to duck a little early the next day if you can, and things like that. And the fact that this is still an ongoing problem in game development is a little sad. I wish that there is a more firm solution to fixing this, because I don't know, it kind of stinks when you hear people saying how they really want to be a game developer and then they stay for less than 5 years because they just get burned out so quickly. That's not okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the turnaround and the burnout that feels so prevalent, especially in stories that we're hearing, is obviously a result of things like that across the industry. We're not just talking about Naughty Dog here in that regard, and it's something that we continue to hear about, and obviously something we want to continue to discuss on the show because it's important. In our minds, I think, as everyone has said, we love playing these games. We are so impressed by the incredible amount of work that goes into all of it, but we never want that work to cause people's lives to be hurt because they were making a video game. No one should ever have to suffer making a video game to get us a cool weapon at a game. That just shouldn't be how it goes. And so we hope to continue seeing this change, obviously, as we hear more about these stories at PlayStation Studios, at third parties on PlayStation, just in general. The industry will talk about it as it comes up. But as I mentioned, that is an interview. Those quotes I pulled from are a larger interview on Game Informers. You can go check that out for a full deep dive there. But to move on a little bit to something else that we've seen this past week, I do want to briefly touch on it because we're running a little short on time. But I didn't want to let the week go, especially Taylor, now that you're on this week's episode, without quickly mentioning something interesting in terms of game development, of seeing really, really early production on a AAA third-party game, and that's the Dead Space remake, currently being made at Motive as part of EA. This was announced earlier this year, and we got a live stream earlier this week of a couple of the leads on the game, showing extremely early looks at this. This was stuff that was legitimately wireframe test rooms where they were trying out combat where nothing else but the player and the enemies were at all polished. It's very bare bones in some places because this is how they're testing things out, how they're developing things. We got a couple of shots that were elemental moods and ideas of what a hallway might be like if you're watching the show. I recommend checking it out. Huge shout out to also former Podcast Beyond guest Khalif Adams, who was co-hosting that stream. It was really well done. I loved this really, really early look. I loved that they were being so honest about this, because I feel like when it comes to AAA game development, it is always so secretive. And obviously this is, a pre-planned stream by the devs showing specific things, wanting to show it in a good light, of course. But I think this is a really interesting approach, and I hope we see more of this, not just from Dead Space, but in general. I really appreciate how honest this was of you're seeing a lot of really unfinished stuff here, but here it is for everyone to see, not just a behind closed doors demonstration. Here it is for everyone to see. Brian, I'll briefly start with you, and then Taylor, I definitely want to hop over to you. But Brian, what do you think of this?
Yeah, no, you nailed it. I'm such a geek for behind the scenes making of stuff. Historically, I'm not crazy about when games get announced with these sort of navel gazy videos. EA had a history of doing that for a while, of sort of being like, "Here's me on my computer, and I'm making a Star Wars game," and I'm like, "Can I see it?" And they're like, "No." And that's not the case here, right? I think this is a remake, so we sort of understand what the skeletal frame of this game is going to be like. Because we've played it before. Many of us have, and if you haven't, please do, because it's great. But B, it's just really cool to see, here's them presenting problems and solutions, talking about that with transparency, and sort of saying, this is a concept art. This is the mood we're going for here. We're going to flat out say there's no microtransactions. This is, some of the ideas and some of the tests, the triumphs and failures along the way. That stuff is so cool. And I appreciate that they're bringing fans into this and really going, this is a really important franchise to a lot of people, and we recognize that it sort of lost its way here and there, but also like the core philosophy of Dead Space connected so well with so many people, and we want to talk to those people, and we want to see what we can do to make them happy, and that's really, really awesome. So props to EA for doing this.
Yeah, I think it's a really cool look. And yeah, it ties into their broader theme of trying to bring in sort of like community councils to help, advise on making sure they get it right. I think it's a really cool thing. But yeah, Taylor, I wanted to throw to you, just as like a huge Dead Space fan, I know, what do you think of the first look? How is it sort of living up to your expectations? And what do you think of this kind of like early peek at what we're hoping to see?
Oh man, just watching that was just a real treat. I loved the first Dead Space. I think back of the memories of the first time I saw the commercial for it before it came out. I was like, I have to play this. And Dead Space 2 was great. Dead Space 3, I don't want to talk about that, but the fact that the series had the fall that it did, the fall from grace that it did, and when I heard that they were going to remake the first game, and I was really cautious, just because it definitely, as the series progressed with the few games that it had, it definitely focused more on like that action kind of thing, and I was like, no, bring back the horror. I think there was a little bit of apprehension that at least I saw online, where people were like, why are they remaking the first game? The first game was great. It was great, but at the same time too, like I'm not sure. I think this is probably the best way for them to go with remaking the game, and the fact that they're showing us early production development build and just being like, hey, here's what we're working on. This is what we got so far. That level of transparency, I think, is very crucial when developers are taking the mantle of a beloved franchise. It helps engage the community. It helps get community feedback much earlier in the development. And not only is it beneficial to the developers, but it's also beneficial to the community and just the fans of the series as a whole. And I just can't stop looking at one of the comparison pictures of the first game, from the original to the development build. I was like, yes, I know this is an early build, but oh my God, the lighting, the atmosphere, the detail on Isaac's armor, just all this stuff. They're striking so many good chords with me, and I'm more excited to learn more about this game. I'm excited to see how they handle this game, because I was like, I don't know who else could handle Dead Space. I don't know. Visceral's gone. Like, I don't know if I'd want anybody else to touch it, but this put me a little bit better peace of mind. I want to see more. I'm hoping they show us more soon, but I think this is they're moving things in the right direction, and I wish that AAA developers did more of this, especially when they're bringing back a dormant franchise that everybody's like, oh, I don't know if I really want them to work on this or something like that. So
yeah, It's obviously with something like a remake, they have a little bit more leeway showing things, because the full game is known, in comparison to, say, like, if they had been doing this with The Last of Us Part 2 on, just to go back to Naughty Dog, it might have been weird for them to show too much, but with a remake, they have a little bit more leeway. But yeah, I totally agree. I really love the precedent this sets, and I hope we continue to see it with future games, not just at EA, but broadly. Mitchell, any thoughts on the live stream, if you watched, or just, the general?
It's just such a breath of fresh air to see a big publisher like EA be willing to show an in-progress look of like this really big AAA game. Because usually what happens is, we see vertical slices, we see really, really beautiful trailers that aren't quite representative of what it's actually going to be when the game comes out. In not in the way of like this was, but in the opposite direction. of it being like way nicer looking than it actually ended up being. So it's just such a refreshing change that they're willing to be almost this vulnerable with this game and show, it's so early in development. So yeah, I love it. I especially love what they're doing with the damage models, or like, how enemies react when they get shot, how like chunks of their arm get blown off. It very much very much reminds me of like Doom Eternal, just in terms of like the way enemies, wear their damage.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what you would want to see in a game like Dead Space. So I think they did a good job of answering why Dead Space could use a remake, because so many people were like, you don't need to remake Dead Space. Dead Space is perfect. So yeah, I love this.
Yeah, I think it was a really cool look. We got confirmation that the original voice actor is reprising his role for Isaac, and some looks at things like you said. The dismemberment is such a thing that's synonymous with Dead Space, and so yeah, finding ways in which they're using the new technology to actually up the ante of what that means for combat and things of that nature is a really cool look at it. So yeah, hats off to the Motive team for doing this. I hope we see more of these from Dead Space, because I'm just really interested, as it seems we all are in it. But yeah, I hope we get to see more of this. I get that it's a worrying thing, because it can create certain expectations from the audience of like, well, you showed this, what happened? Because things change all the time in game development. So of course, that is very understandably a worry. But I appreciated the way they couched this, the way they framed it, and what they showed off. So yeah, really happy to see that. And again, if you want to check out the full stream, it's out there. I definitely recommend it. Whether or not you're a huge Dead Space fan, it's just a really interesting look at development. Before we wrap up, since we're pretty late on time, do just want to briefly throw to, I guess, sort of a combo of / things you've been playing / things you might want to promote, content that you've been working on, anything like that. So Brian, I'll start with you.
I've been playing Saints Row 2. I went and revisited that game after the reveal of the new Saints Row reboot, because I noticed there was a large conversation among that audience that I guess I'd never really put together, that audience has been completely splintered and split in half for a very long time now, between people who really like Saints Row 2 because it was, semi gritty and serious at times while still being slapstick and cartoony all over the place, and Saints Row 3, which like totally veered into kind of nonsense world. And I've always really loved both. I've always preferred 3. The developers of the reboot said they're sort of like looking at 3 as the sort of the boilerplate, or the template for where they want to go with the new reboot, which obviously, kind of frustrated some players. But I'm playing 2 now to sort of reconnect with that franchise. I've been doing that a lot with games when Far Cry 6 got announced. I'm like, let me go play the old Far Cry games. And I'm really enjoying it. So I'm almost done with it, actually. And I'll probably talk more about it next week. But yeah, I'm just happy they're making a new Saints Row game. So
nice. And Mitchell, want to throw to you. You've since we last had you on, not last week, but before that, you've been in quite a busy review period. You did the Ghost of Tsushima Iki Island expansion review. You just put up, I believe, today. Did you do Sonic Colors Ultimate?
Yeah, Sonic Colors Ultimate, Sonic Colors Remastered.
Yeah, you did both those reviews, but yeah. So what have you been playing / what do you want to point people toward?
Oh, I gotta be careful here. I'm playing some embargoed stuff.
I mean, the next God of War is great. I agree. But, I've never heard of it. So
if it's Elden Ring, tell the crow to scroll 3 times.
No, I've been playing obviously Sonic Colors Ultimate, which I really enjoyed. I've been playing. What have I been playing? Oh, obviously Guilty Gear Strive. I always play Guilty Gear Strive. That's just a game that I'll probably be playing for the rest of my life. And yeah, I mean, outside of that, apart from some of the embargoed stuff that I've been playing, just games with friends,
yeah,
Among Us.
Fair enough.
I'm sorry, it's a weird answer.
I'm trying to solve the puzzle of what
I know what they could be. But yeah, I definitely
biggest games.
If it's a review, Mitchell might be doing it because he does those.
It's
quite
not
well.
a game I'm reviewing. I'll say
but anyway, I just want to point people toward your Iki Island review. It was a really great review, as of course you reviewed the original game as well. So people have probably already jumped into the expansion. I know that the standalone Legends mode is available starting this Friday for people. But yeah, go check out that review if you haven't. And if you're a Sonic fan, go check out the Sonic Colors Ultimate. I've never played Colors, so I'm looking forward to it.
It's one of the best modern Sonic games. So if you're at all curious about Sonic,
awesome.
Definitely check it out.
Always curious about Sonic. That's how I live my life. The internet's great for that. Taylor,
what causes
anything?
this blue hedgehog to run so fast?
It's the power of Ben Schwartz's voice is what I imagine. Taylor, anything you want to point people towards / what have you've been playing that you want to highlight?
Well, I recently beat Psychonauts 2,
Nice.
And I'm going to start playing. Oh yeah, it's so good. It was well worth the 15 plus years that we had to wait for this game. But I'm also about to start Ghost of Tsushima Director's Cut. I waited to play this game because I was like, do I want to buy it on PS4? They're probably gonna release it again on PS5. I'm glad I did that. So I'm gonna play that soon. I am playing a game for review. I cannot say what it is, unfortunately, but so I'm gonna have to try to split times for that, but obviously the review is going to prioritize for me. But I'm excited to play Ghost of Tsushima. I read Mitchell's review for both the expansion and the base game, and I was like, oh god, I gotta play this so bad. So that's on my current plate right now.
Let's trade NDAs. I'll tell you if you tell me.
If you play this episode backwards, you'll actually hear every game they've been playing. But yeah, Taylor, I hope you enjoy Ghost. Definitely a lot. Roughly double the time you expect to play to also include photo mode time. You're going to spend a lot of time taking photos.
And petting the animals.
Yes, which there's now even more in Iki Island. It's great to just go up to a bunch of monkeys and hang out with them. It's wonderful.
I'm actually super envious of you that you're playing that. That's like one of those, like, I wish I could wipe my mind and play it from scratch. Yeah, you're going to have so much fun with the game. You're going to get so lost in it. It's just such a beautiful world.
It's such a great world.
It's so good.
It's so great. We'll definitely talk about Ghost more on maybe a quieter week, but we had a lot to talk about. But yeah, check out Mitchell's piece, both the Iki Island review and the Sonic Colors Ultimate review, and all the other work Mitchell's been doing recently. But yeah, I've been playing Iki Island. I started up Genshin Impact because I need to get Aloy because I'm a PlayStation podcast host and I need Aloy when she appears in another game.
Who's your current
so
squad?
I've been doing that.
Who's your current squad
I'm just at the beginning of the game, so it's still pretty much like the basic people, whose names I'm forgetting. But the ice guy, the fire woman with the bow, the lightning librarian, and my character. So yeah, it's really fun. I like it. It's a very pretty world, and I like just hanging out in it. And yeah, I have lost several nights already this week to it, and that's probably going to be the case for a little while. But that pretty much wraps us up for this week's episode of Podcast Beyond. Thank you, Brian, Mitchell, and Taylor for joining me for this week's episode. Thank you all for taking the time. And thank you to Red, our producer, as always, for making the show happen. And thank you to everyone out there for watching and listening. And thank you to everyone who sent in questions and everything for this episode as well. We hope you're safe. We hope you're well. And as always, beyond.
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 Beyond.